Hi, everyone. Welcome to the show. My name is Ron Guth, and today I have a very special guest. His name is Stephen Guth. Now, if that name sounds familiar, or if you think that we look alike, kind of, that's because we're brothers. Stephen is the author of numerous books about negotiations, and he's here today to talk about his most recent book, which is titled Hardball Negotiations, Vendor Ploys, and Buyer Tactics. Stephen, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Ron. Appreciate you having me on your podcast.
Stephen, before we dig into your most recent book, tell us a little bit about yourself and your experience in your career and how you became an expert negotiator.
Well, Ron, as you know, I've been your brother for about 60 years now, and for almost 30 of those years, I've been responsible for negotiating procurements and contracts on behalf of my employers. So, as an example, if a company needs to procure, let's say, a complex automation solution to run their business, or they need to maybe outsource services, I would help that company buy what it needs and to get the best deal possible.
Very good. Now, you say you've been doing this for about 30 years. I assume that you've been involved in a lot of deals. How many deals do you think in all that you've negotiated?
Well, that's a good question. A big part of how my performance is measured is really based on the number of deals that I do and the money that I save my employer as a result of the negotiation. So it's really important for me to track those sort of metrics, and I've tracked them. So over the years, I've done about, and this is just a rough approximation, 9,000 deals, and that would represent a combined value of over $10 billion. And I've negotiated over $100 million in cost savings or cost avoidance for my employers. So a big chunk of money.
Yeah. That's it seems like a lot of deals and a lot of money that you saved your companies. Do you work on a salary or do you get paid a commission, hopefully?
Ron, I wish, right? If I did, I wouldn't be doing this podcast, right? And I'd probably have some awesome coins like a mint state 1794 flowing dollar or a 43 copper penny or a 1913 V nickel, but I don't get a commission. So I've got some Wheaties and some Buffaloes laying around. That's about it. I get paid a base salary, no commissions, no bonuses, but I do negotiate with sales teams who get commissions. And the more that they sell, the more that they get paid.
That sounds good. Well, if it was up to me, I'd give you a commission, but we'll leave it at that. Let's talk about your most recent book. Again, it's titled Hardball Negotiations, Vendor Ploys, and Buyer Tactics. That title sounds pretty hardcore, pretty serious. What's it about?
Well, here's a picture of it.
Okay.
Does that look pretty hardcore?
It looks like you're ready to play hardball.
A lot of capital letters and a lot of red. Yeah, so it's hardcore. Yeah, there's a lot of great books out there about negotiations. Most of them, they have their own recommended method or style of negotiation, but they all have one thing in common, and that's that they'll assume that your worthy adversary will negotiate with you in good faith and they'll cooperatively seek a win-win result.
Okay, that sounds like a good thing. What's wrong with that?
Well, I mean, it's just not realistic. Sure, that's how some negotiations go, where both parties would seek a win-win result, but really a vast majority of negotiations that involve your worthy adversary are going to involve them trying to get the best deal that they can, and that's going to be at your expense. My book instead focuses on how to negotiate against those win-lose worthy adversaries.
Stephen, you've mentioned worthy adversary a couple times now. What does that mean? What is a worthy adversary?
Well, that's your negotiating counterpart. So your worthy adversary is who you're negotiating with and most often against. In my line of work, my worthy adversary is a negotiator who represents a vendor. And as I mentioned, they get paid on commission. They're highly trained to sell. They really know their products and services inside and out. And they have an army of people literally lined up behind them to make that deal happen. When you're up against someone like that, it's really not a level playing field. They're your the adversary. They are the tip of the spear at their companies, and their job is to sell you something and maximize their profit and commission so that they can buy that luxury car or the vacation house or that rare coin. So often they'll use these hardball negotiation ploys to crush you as their negotiation partner.
The title of your book includes the terms ploys and tactics. What's the difference between those two things, and aren't they all just negotiation techniques?
Well, you're right. They are all negotiation techniques, but there is a significant difference between the two. So ploys, or what I call sleazy ploys, are what your adversary, what your worthy adversary uses, and then tactics are what a buyer would use, like what you and I would use to counter those sleazy ploys. So think of it this way: ploys are bad. That's what your worthy adversary uses, and then tactics are good. That's what we would use.
Okay, got it. So you're saying ploys are bad and tactics are good. But before we get into some of the individual ploys and tactics in your book, can you give me a general sense of, in your experience, how a typical negotiation goes? Just walk me through that.
Sure. So every negotiation is different, obviously, and has its own twists and turns, but there definitely is a certain flow to negotiations. And there's that flow, I would call it the negotiation alphabet soup. It's MDO, LAA, ZOPA, BATNA, and WATNA.
Oh, okay. Those are a lot of acronyms that I'm not really familiar with, or our viewers may not be. I assume they're all explained in your book.
Yeah, absolutely. There's these acronyms are pretty important acronyms. They're widely known and used in the negotiation world, and I'll kind of go over how they work. So when people negotiate, they have an idea of what they really want, right? And then they also have an idea of the result that they'd accept, and when they'd walk away from the deal because it's just not a good deal for them. So MDO, that means most desirable outcome. That's what someone would want or would like to get out of a negotiation. And LAA means your least acceptable agreement. That's what someone would accept, perhaps begrudgingly. And then BATNA means your best alternative to a negotiated agreement, and that's a person's walkaway point. If a person can't get their LAA, their least acceptable agreement, they need to have a backup plan. And that's what a BATNA is. It's their best alternative if they can't negotiate a deal with their worthy adversary. And then a WATNA, that is the worst alternative to a negotiated agreement. What that means is you sometimes don't have a great BATNA. And you need to recognize that to ensure that you don't have unreasonable expectations, such as too high of an MDO, a most desirable outcome, meaning that you want too much.
Mm-hmm.
And then ZOPA is the zone of possible agreement. So each party to a negotiation has an expectation of what they want, like I said, and what they need, and then what they'd accept. Ideally, in a negotiation, those two parties are going to have some sort of overlap, that one party's wants and another party's wants and needs, that there's going to be overlap. And that overlap represents the ZOPA, or the zone of possible agreement. The process and flow of a negotiation is really to probe each other's wants and needs, and then to find this common ground so the parties can conclude the transaction and so that they don't have to go their separate directions, meaning that they don't have to implement their best alternative to a negotiated agreement, or a BATNA.
Got it. Okay, so that's a lot of negotiation alphabet soup to digest. Can you give us like a sample or a real life example that's a little bit easier to grasp?
Sure. So let's use that. Let's use the rare coins I mentioned earlier. In fact, let's use the 1913 B nickel that I mentioned that I would love to own, right?
Okay.
Ron, give me a sense of how rare that coin is and how much it's worth.
Okay, it's a very rare coin. There's only five known, and they typically sell for $2 to $5 million depending on condition. So it's a very valuable coin.
Okay, $2 to $5 million. Yeah, so that's not inexpensive. All right, so let's say that you have that coin, and you want to sell it, and I'd like to buy it. So I know you mentioned 2 to 5 million, but how much would you like to get for it? The 5 million?
That would be if it's finest known. I'd say yeah, let's say 5 million.
Okay.
That's what I would like to get for it.
All right, so $5 million, going back to the alphabet soup of negotiation, that $5 million is your MDO, your most desirable outcome. All right, so now let's talk about how much you'd be willing to accept. So what would be the least that you would accept for that coin?
Probably, let's say 4.5 million.
Okay, so five, and the least you accept is 4.5. So 4.5 million, that's your LAA, your least acceptable agreement. So the least you'd be willing to accept for the coin. Now, I would know your MDO. I mean, you would literally tell me that because you'd have to tell me how much you want for the coin. But you're not going to tell me that 4.5 million. You're not going to tell me your least acceptable agreement. So I would know that. As a negotiator, though, it's my job to figure that out, figure out your LAA. So in response to your MDO of the $5 million, what you want for the coin, I'd probably counteroffer, right? My counteroffer is likely my MDO, meaning, ideally what I'd like to get the coin for. So that really means that the least that I'd like to pay, right? But again, I don't know your LAA. I don't know about that 4.5 million. You don't know about my LAA. So it's my job to figure that out, the least that you'd accept, and then it's your job to figure out the max that I'd pay. So hopefully my LAA and MDO overlaps yours so that we have that ZOPA, or zone of possible agreement, and that you'd make a profit and then I'd get the coin that I want. So let's continue with that example. Let's say that I'm only willing to offer $1 million. I'm only willing to pay $1 million for the coin. So would you accept that?
Absolutely not. It's probably less than what I paid.
Then in that case, what would you do with the coin if I'm not willing to pay your LAA, which is, I think it was 4.5 million, that, the least that you'd accept for that coin?
I guess that would be, I would take it off the market, or I wouldn't sell it, or maybe I'd have to consider lowering my LAA. But right in this point, if you're not willing to pay the 4.5 million, I would take it off the market.
Right, or you try to find another buyer.
You sure?
So all
Sure.
those things that you just mentioned, all those alternatives, those are your BATNAs, or your best alternative to a negotiated agreement. So if you couldn't sell it to me, take it off the market, find someone else, right? Your WATNA, or your worst alternative to negotiated agreement, is probably taking the coin off the market, because obviously it'd be better for you to sell the coin to someone else, get your capital back, then use that capital to buy more coins, and so on and so forth, to make a profit.
Sure, that makes sense. Now, where in this negotiation do the ploys and the tactics come into play? Let's say we're talking about that 1913 nickel. How would those ploys and tactics come about?
When you're negotiating with someone who wants to win at your expense, that's your worthy adversary. They're going to use these sleazy ploys to influence, manipulate, and trick you into getting their most desirable outcome, their MDO, and maybe even more, while you get your least acceptable agreement and maybe even less. Mike Tyson, the boxer, he is quoted as saying, and I'm sure your listeners have probably heard this quote before, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. And that quote really fits perfectly with negotiations.
Yeah.
And I like to mix it up a little bit, that quote, which is, everyone has a negotiation plan until they get punched in the gut.
Mm.
And knowing that negotiation alphabet soup of MDO and LAA and ZOPA and BATNA and WATNA, and following win-win negotiation strategies, that works great until you get punched in the gut. Then what do you do, right? So I've got another analogy for this. So you've heard of Taekwondo, right?
Sure, the martial art.
Right. So, and I'm way oversimplifying this, but Taekwondo basically means kick and punch. When you kick and punch, you're standing when you do that. You stand to kick and punch.
Mm.
So online, there's all these crazy fighting videos. Have you ever seen any of those videos where people are scrapping it out, like on YouTube or anything like that?
Sure, sure. I've watched like MMA videos, UFC, kickboxing.
After the first couple of punches, though, and when you're looking at those videos, after the first couple of punches and maybe a kick or two, what happens then?
They try to take it to the ground.
Yeah, so they're on the ground fighting. So my point is that Taekwondo isn't enough.
Mm.
Kicking and punching is enough. If you want to be effective at defending yourself, you're going to need to know Taekwondo, and you're going to need to know something else like judo or jujitsu, which is the martial art of subduing someone when you're on the ground. And it works that same way with other negotiation books versus my book. Those win-win negotiation books, they teach you how to negotiate under perfect conditions. And my book teaches you how to fight under imperfect conditions. So when your worthy adversary punches you in the gut and they knock you on the ground with their down and dirty hardball negotiation tactics, then you know what to do.
Mm.
And not to brag, Ron, but I am, believe it or not, I'm a red belt in Taekwondo and I'm a brown belt in judo.
Red and brown. Now, those are two colors that we in numismatics like, especially on copper coins. So, color me impressed.
Okay.
I read your book, of course. In addition to the ploys and tactics that you talk about, you also talk about neuroscience, such as delving into the human brain and neurotransmitters and hormones. What do those have to do with negotiation?
So hardball negotiations, they're all about manipulating emotions and the human response. And when it comes to negotiations, the more you know about why you react to certain things, the more that you're going to be able to control yourself and control your reactions and be able to out negotiate your worthy adversary. So in my book, I do get into detail about how neurotransmitters such as like oxytocin and dopamine and cortisol, how they impact or benefit you in negotiations. And general rule, at least in my mind, is negotiations is about 50% chemicals that are produced by your brain and your body and 50% skill. So, like many things, when you know the why of something, the how of something is really that much easier. And I think that's one reason why my book is so powerful for a person that wants to be a better negotiator. Learn why you react and behave in a negotiation, and you're already 50% of the way there of being a better and more effective negotiator. And now you just need to learn how to spot those sleazy ploys and counter them with devastating tactics, and that's all in my book.
Stephen, that sounds so obvious and logical. Know yourself and know your opponent. Now, in your book, you created some great names for these ploys and tactics, and some of them I really like Best Friends Forever, Coffee and Donuts, and the one that really hit me good was the torture chamber. Can you
Uh,
give the listeners a sneak peek into those ploys and tactics?
yeah, absolutely. So I had some fun with the names, and I thought that made it pretty interesting. I'll start with Best Friends Forever. So that's probably the most important ploy in the book for your worthy adversary to leverage. If your worthy adversary implements that ploy well, every other ploy is going to be that much easier for them to implement. But if they don't implement Best Friends Forever well, then every ploy, every other ploy for them is going to be that much more difficult for them to implement. So I came up with a fun name for the ploy, but it's really anything but. In fact, the ploy is based on spycraft that is used by intelligence agencies
Mm.
around the world.
Mm-hmm.
But obviously they don't call it best friend forever.
Yeah.
They call it much more serious things: elicitation, social engineering, human hacking. The premise of this ploy is that your worthy adversary befriends you, and then they use that so-called friendship to exploit your natural human traits and then your tendencies and cultural predispositions, and they'll use all those things to manipulate you.
That's interesting. I've actually experienced the best friends forever ploy or tactic in the past, and I can tell you that having experienced it, I kind of feel sheepish and a little stupid for having fallen prey to it, but it seems like such a natural thing. And so when you talk about traits and natural traits and tendencies, what do you mean by those?
Well, I think everybody's fallen for this ploy at one point, in their life or whenever they're dealing with, a negotiation or any sort of deal making. So don't feel bad. We've all been there.
Yeah.
But as humans, the reason that we've been there is that we want to be helpful and we want to be appreciated. But we also like to complain. We like to tell other people how to do things, and we like to talk about ourselves. your worthy adversary, they will use those desires and those tendencies against you. They'll express a keen interest in you. They'll flatter you. They'll wine and dine you, and you'll feel special with all that,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And like I mentioned, wine and dine. They'll ply you with alcohol. It is a social lubricant. Alcohol is a social lubricant that will get you to blab a lot of information that you probably shouldn't have. Then your new bestie is going to have all of this information about you or about potentially the deal that they're going to be able to use against you. So you're giving them this information, and they're taking all this information in, and they're also making you feel like your best friend, right? So when you get into that negotiation, you're going to feel obligated to them because they've made you feel special as your best friend. And then they'll also have insider information.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really a deadly combination because you'll cave on concessions and then you'll be even less likely to ask for concessions.
Boy, that sounds so familiar, and I know exactly what you're talking about. And later on in my career, I actually counsel some of my employees to say, you have to be careful about the people that are going to approach you because they're
Right.
going to want to take you to dinner or, let's go out and get a drink or something. And I said they're really there not to be your friend, but they're there to get information from you. So I can see where that is a common tactic that people use. Now, how if you've never had it happen to you, what's the best way to recognize that someone is using this ploy on you, and what's the counter tactic to this best friends forever?
Sure. There's definitely signs to watch out for, and my book gets into those things. There are techniques like psychographics and the conversational hourglass to watch out for. And when you spot those techniques that I just described and I describe in the book, you've basically spotted best friends forever.
Mm-hmm.
And again, spotting the ploy, like you sort of alluded to, is half the battle. And there are counter tactics that I describe in the book that even the FBI uses and the U.S. Defense Counterintelligence Agency agencies use. But to give you some general guidance or general advice for the counter tactic to use against it is to realize that your worthy adversary isn't your best friend, like you pointed out, and never will be. In fact, they probably don't want to be your best friend, right? That it's a job for them to have to do that.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a rapport ploy, and basically you're the mark. Your worthy adversary views you as a means to an end, which is their payday, and really nothing more and nothing less. But when you dry up as a potential or actual revenue source, who you thought was your best friend, they're going to ghost you.
Man, I know exactly what you're talking about. That's exactly what happened. My best friend was just impossible to get a hold of, never contacted me again after that. That was, like I said, I felt sheepish. I felt stupid that gotten taken in because I like to think that I'm a good judge of character, but it turns out that, these guys that are good, effective negotiators can really use it against you. So I feel the pain that sort of thing causes. Um, Now, what about coffee and donuts? That's another ploy you have in there.
Yeah, coffee and donuts. So I mentioned that best friends forever, that's a vendor ploy. So that's something that your worthy adversary uses, and it's a rapport ploy. Coffee and donuts is a buyer tactic. So that's going to
Mm,
be something that you and I would use.
okay.
And it's a classic reciprocity ploy, or rather tactic. It's something that we would use. So coffee and donuts, it's what I call a triple whammy ploy. And the first whammy is that when you perform this unsolicited favor, right, the giving the donuts, that elicits an innate human response or desire to reciprocate. So when you provide those donuts to your worthy adversary before or at the beginning of a negotiation, and this is according to scientific research, they're going to be 3 times more likely to reciprocate during that negotiation. So that relatively inexpensive donut that your worthy adversary is chomping away on, that is going to get them to potentially cave on concessions that are worth to you much, much more.
That's interesting that you actually have coffee and donuts in there. I've actually purchased donuts for people, and it's amazing to me what those donuts are worth. It costs
Right,
you $14 or $15 for a dozen donuts, and it's like you spent $1 million the way that people respond
right.
to it. So it's like returning a favor. Someone pays you a favor, like buying you a donut, and then you want to pay them back.
Yep, exactly. So you give someone a donut and then you get a concession in return.
All right, so you said this tactic is a triple whammy, and you've covered one. What are the second and third whammies that are coming?
Right. So here's the second whammy. And not to get too scientific about it, but it turns out that self-control is a metabolically expensive process that consumes tons of glucose. So glucose, you've probably heard of it before, that's a chemical in the bloodstream that results from nutritional intake that's ultimately converted into neurotransmitters, and those in turn provide energy for your complex brain processes. And research indicates that the administration of glucose can be beneficial in reducing aggression in response to provocation. So, what all of that technobabble just means is that we're more likely to behave aggressively when our glucose levels are low, and that the consumption of glucose bolsters self control and regulates aggressive behavior. So the second whammy is that donuts have tons, as you would expect, tons of glucose.
Mm-hmm.
So those tasty donuts, they magically reduce the likelihood that your worthy adversary is going to use those sleazy ploys, and it's going to increase the likelihood of them agreeing to your demands.
Mm-hmm. And who doesn't like a good donut?
I love a good
Mm-hmm.
donut, but not the cake kind. I'm not a cake donut kind of person. I'm the other kind. I like the I guess it's the fried kind. All right, so the third and final whammy is warmth. So studies show that physical warmth has an immediate impact on human physiology, and it increases feelings of interpersonal warmth as well as generous behavior. So in one study, participants who they briefly held a cup of hot coffee, they judged the people that they interacted with as being warmer, having warmer personalities than the control group in the study. And what that means is that when you hand your worthy adversary a cup of coffee to go along with that donut, they're going to feel more connected to you. They're going to be less demanding in their concessions, and they're going to be more willing to cave to your demands.
Okay, well, I better start bringing coffee with those donuts to coin shows. That was very interesting. Thank you for that. So let's cover the final and my favorite negotiation technique. I'm almost scared to ask, knowing you, but
Uh,
tell me about the torture chamber.
not only did I want to inform people and equip people to be more effective negotiators, I wanted this book to be interesting and hopefully sometimes humorous. And that's why I included the torture chamber tactic. It's a real tactic, but I definitely don't advocate its use. And as you might guess from the name, it's a tactic that involves environmental or logistical aspects of being in that in-person negotiation room. And the idea of torture chamber is that these many tactics impair your worthy adversary's negotiation effectiveness through your worthy adversary's physical discomfort and physiological distress. Basically, the more uncomfortable we are, and this is probably not a surprise, the higher our stress level is going to be, and therefore the less effective of a negotiator we are. There's something that professional buyers call believe it or not, the vendor chair. And that is the chair at the negotiation table where your worthy adversary, the vendor, would sit. But it is more than just a regular conference room chair. It's a very special chair. The vendor chair is shorter than your chair
Mm.
and that of anyone else on your team that you might have as a part of your negotiation. And that height difference gives you dominating physical presence over your worthy adversary and makes them feel small and feel weak. Basically, displays of physical dominance, they are shown to elevate testosterone, even in women, which increases energy and lowers cholesterol, or rather cortisol. And that reduces stress in the dominator. And the opposite effect manifests itself in the dominated. They'll have lower energy and higher stress.
Mm-hmm.
So basically what you want to do is you want to position that vendor chair across the conference table from your chair, and that will create this confrontational and physically distant environment. And ideally, you want to place that vendor chair with its back facing the door. Not only is that taboo feng shui, but it goes against our survival instinct. So as humans, we have this primal desire to, even if we don't know it, to have line of sight to an escape route. And when we don't, we feel trapped and our stress level rises. We might not really consciously know why it's rising, but instinctively our limbic system tells us that this is a dangerous situation and our stress levels rise. For the conference room table itself, I talked about the chair. For the conference room table, rectangular is ideal. And the reason why is that the angular shape and the resulting physical distance of the seated occupants to accommodate that shape is going to increase anxiety and to increase tension.
That's very interesting. You mentioned that particular chair. You've described the chair that I sit in on almost every flight I've been on. It's absolute torture.
It is. I've been in that middle seat too. A lot of the torture that I mentioned, and a lot of it in this tactic, has to do with what's called embodied cognition. And that's a really fancy way of saying just touch. Touch is the first sense that we develop as humans. It's really, it's a critical means of how we obtain information, both consciously and subconsciously. And obviously it's how we manipulate our physical environment. So researchers, not surprisingly, discovered that our physical surroundings affect our perceptions and our judgment. For example, we tend to view a social interaction as more difficult or rigid if our bodies are touching rough or hard objects during the interaction. So that chair that we were just talking about, the vendor chair, when you have the vendor chair, not only do you want it to be shorter, ideally it's going to be rock hard, and that's going to make your worthy adversary physically uncomfortable and anxious. And it's also a really nice touch if your worthy adversary's chair is, there's something about it that's broken, like it doesn't recline, or all it does is recline. And like the arms of that chair, if they're soiled or cracked or otherwise damaged, that's just a nice touch.
Wow, that's some very scary techniques. I'm impressed by the science behind it. That you have a soiled, cracked, or damaged chair because it's going to impact your worthy adversary and make him worth less adversary. What other things lurk in the torture chamber?
Well, you would expect a torture chamber to be dark,
Dark.
but in this torture chamber, it's actually light. So lighting can be used to your advantage. And to talk about science a little bit, obviously, people that have worked in an office environment, fluorescent lights, they just suck the life out of you. And it's a scientific fact. Fluorescent lights, the way that they work is they ionize mercury vapor in this argon gas. And that causes these charged atoms to collide and emit this ultraviolet photons when they're electrified. And those collisions result in this really extremely high-speed flickering that is so fast that to our eyes it looks like continuous light, except that it's not continuous, and our brain sees that flickering.
Mm-hmm.
And so all of that high-speed on and off flickering, along with all of that ultraviolet radiation that's bombarding you, that reduces your productivity and your alertness, and it increases your physical and mental fatigue. And over the long term, it can also cause migraines and epileptic seizures and even retinal damage. For those reasons, for the short-term reasons, you want to conduct your negotiation in a room that has fluorescent lighting.
Well, wait a minute. If you're in the same room, aren't you subject to the same effects of the fluorescent lighting as your opponent?
Yeah, so you can minimize those effects, and you can maximize the effects on your worthy adversary by having the right position of seating. So position yourself right under the fluorescent light so that it's directly in the line of sight of your worthy adversary. So whenever they look at you, You want them to get this hefty dose of ultraviolet light and radiation, but obviously you don't want that. So what you want to do is position your worthy adversary to one side or other of that fluorescent light. So one side or the other. That way you're not staring into that light. Also, if your room has blinds or drapes, close them so that there's no natural light that's streaming into the room. And if you see your worthy adversary like squinting or rubbing their eyes, then you know the torture chamber is working.
Okay, the torture chamber sounds brutal.
Oh, there's more. It gets worse.
Oh,
So,
there's more.
and this is really evil. So I'll talk about temperature a little bit. So the ideal ambient temperature for human productivity, and human productivity is basically a combination of verbal, mathematical, and cognitive abilities. That is around 72 to 76 degrees Fahrenheit. Our productivity, that decreases anywhere outside of that range above or below. At around, on the low end, at around 68 degrees Fahrenheit, we lose about 10% of our productivity, believe it or not, and it goes down further as the temperature drops. On the other end of the spectrum, on the high end, at around 80 degrees Fahrenheit, our productivity drops, and we lose another 4% of productivity for each incremental degree upward.
Okay, so let me guess. If you're the torturer, you turn down the AC or you turn up the heat.
Right. So the heat, the hot part, in an office environment, it would probably be difficult, but I think many of us have experienced the office environment and it's usually cold, right? So it's going to be much easier to go to the cold side than the warmer. So my suggestion would be that you crank down the AC if it's not already there to like 68 degrees Fahrenheit or maybe below. Make sure that you have, some smart looking sweater or jacket that you can bring to the negotiation.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Your worthy adversary, they're not going to be expecting that. They probably won't be as well prepared. And if they're not, they're going to be shivering in their shoes. And this is the evil part. A lower temperature also helps to facilitate biological distress.
What is biological distress?
Okay. All right. So, for the sake of your listeners, I'm going to answer that question indirectly by saying this: have plenty of bottled water on hand and drag on the negotiation as long as possible without any breaks. And if you have your worthy adversary, they're a visitor on your site, they're not familiar with your site, don't announce where the restrooms are in your facility. Wait for them to get to their bursting point and wait for them to have to ask you for a bio break and the location of the restrooms. That's biological distress.
You're kidding, right? I mean,
No.
do people actually do this?
Well, I don't advocate its use, but definitely there have been circumstances where people use these sort of torture chamber tactics. And going back to biological distress, believe it or not, there's research for that. And the science indicates that biological distress, it directly impacts our decision making. Urgency is further exacerbated by colder temperatures, like we talked about in our torture chamber. So the way our bodies work is that when cold, we constrict blood vessels to reduce the blood flow to our extremities, like our arms and legs. And we do that to provide needed warmth to our internal organs, the real important part of our bodies. That constriction causes increased blood pressure, and then the body tries to regulate that increased blood pressure by forcing the kidneys to filter out excess fluid. And the net result is that your worthy adversary will need to go urgently and often.
Speaking of that, I drank a lot of water before the podcast, so we're going to have to wrap it up in the next few minutes.
Yeah, yeah, me too. Good news, we're almost there. And that's a good segue into the last part of the torture chamber. There's even
there's
more.
more. There's
There's
more.
more. So timing. Timing is an important element in maximizing that torture. So be sure to negotiate your negotiation on a Wednesday, or rather, be sure to schedule your negotiation on a Wednesday. I don't know
Okay.
if I got that right. Um, it's called Hump Day for a reason. That's the worst day for your worthy adversary to negotiate because the work week has really sort of already beaten them down, and then the weekend is still a long way off. Ideally, let's assume that you're having the negotiation at your facility and your worthy adversary is, out of state. So ideally, if your worthy adversary, they flew in that morning, schedule the negotiation for late in the day after the energy of lunch is worn off and when you know that they're going to be mentally and physically fatigued. But let's say they flew in the night before. Then in that case, you would want to schedule the negotiation for as early as possible in the day so that they've had limited time to rest. So basically, jet lag is your friend, so use that to your advantage. Anyways, the desired effect of all these horrifying things, the hard chair, the bad lighting, the shivering cold, and the bad timing that we just talked about. The effect of all that is that your worthy adversary is going to be extremely uncomfortable rather, and likely willing to cave on concessions so as to mercifully end the negotiation and so that they can get the hell out of your sicko torture chamber as fast as possible, right? So fun but not nice, and that's why I advocate not using this tactic, but I do want people to be aware of it.
That all sounds fascinating. I do have one question for you, though. Uh, Writing this book, won't your worthy adversaries be able to use these techniques against you?
Well, it's kind of interesting because when people think about, trying to upskill, they're really sort of myopic about what they look at. And one of the suggestions that I have for people that want to get skilled on negotiation is to not only buy my book, but to also read sales books, right? Because then you get that insider perspective. So yes, if a salesperson, they want to get this book, very possibly they'd learn these techniques and these ploys and the tactics. But the fact of the matter is that they probably won't, right? That's just the human nature of, we're interested in something and we're myopically focused on that.
Yeah, no, that sounds realistic actually. But when you consider the success that you've had in terms of the amount of money that you've been able to negotiate for your companies, it sounds like one of the best bargains in the world is to buy a book that can teach you how to save you and your company millions of dollars. I mean, that sounds like a no-brainer, but hopefully people will understand that and buy your book. So anyway, I want to thank you for being on the podcast, and I really appreciate the explanations that you've given us today. I know that you have over 50 ploys and tactics in your book, and we've covered
Right,
only 3 of them today. So
right.
if you're listening to this broadcast and podcast and you want to learn about the other 47, please check out Stephen's book, Hardball Negotiations, Vendor Ploys and Buyer Tactics. It's available on Amazon.com, and you can also visit Stephen's website at www.stephenguth.com.
Ron, thank you for having me on your podcast. I enjoyed being with you and your listeners and talking about all these interesting ploys and tactics. So thanks for having me, and I'll see you later.
I'll see you later too, Stephen, and I hope you have good success with your book. For those of you who are watching, if you are interested in content like this, please be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so that anytime I post a new video, YouTube will let you know, so you'll have some good content to view. Thanks a lot for viewing, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.